Hello Hood coders and welcome back. So in this video we're going to finish up to set our UI by using Jetpack Compose. So as you can see here we have this screen. So without any further delay, let's code together and build the calculator. Okay, now let's create here a new Kotlin class or file. So here we're going to create our view model. So we can just create here a new Kotlin class or file, and here now we can just call our calculator view model. And this is just going to inherit from a view model class. Okay, now let's create here a data class, and we can just call here our UI state. Okay, so here we have our Infix expression, and this is just going to be a string, and we can initialize as an empty string. And also we have our result, which also is going to be an empty string. Okay, now let's create here our UI state. So we can just call this UI state, and we can use a mutable state of, and here we create our UI state class. And here we have our own infix change. So we can just create here a function that is going to help us when an infix is going to change. So on infix change. And here now we can try to reinitialize. So we can just call here UI state.apply. And now we can just initialize our UI state, and we can just easily copy this and pass in the infix here. And we want to append this with a new infix. And for that case here, so we are just going to append all of this inside our infix expression so that we can just create a single string here. Okay, now let's create here another function, and this function is going to help us to clear the infix expression. So we can just call this clear infix. So here we can just call here our UI state, and we can just easily call UI state.copy. And we can just reinitialize this to an empty string again. Okay, now we want to create here a function that is going to help us to change the result. So we can just create here a private function, and we can call this on result change. And now here we can just call our UI state, and we can copy. And we can easily change our result back to this one. Okay, now let's create here a function that is going to help us to evaluate this expression. So we can just call here evaluate. Okay, now we want to check if the infix expression is not empty. So you can just call here our UI state. And we can check if this is not blank. And if this is not the case, then we can call on result change. And we want to use now our model class here, and we want to get the result. So we can just call here our UI state.infix. And for that case, we are going to receive our result. Okay, now we have finished to create our view model. So we can just easily create here a new class. Okay, now here we can create our new composable function, and we can just call this home calculator. And here we can basically pass in our calculator view model. Okay, now let's create here a box, and we can just pass inside here modifier. And we can fill the max size. Okay, and here we can just create a content margin. Okay, now let's create here a preview function. So we can just call prev here. And here we can just call our home calculator, and we're required to pass in a view model, so we can just make this to pass nullable, and we can just easily make this to be null in order we check this. Okay, now let's start here our preview function. Okay, now and also here we can just call show system UI, and we can make this to be true. Okay, now let's start to code here. Now let's create a column, because everything is just going to be inside the column, and here we can just pass in a modifier, and we want to pass in the align, so you can just call the align, and we want to align this to the bottom center. Okay, so now we want to create these two text here, so we can just create a column and then hold these two text field here. Okay, now let's create here a column, and here basically now we can just pass in a modifier, and we can just pass inside here a horizontal padding, and we can just use our content margin which we have created here. And we want to align this to the end. Okay, so now here we can just create our first text. And we want to use our UI state. And if this state is going to be null, so we want to return this text here. Okay, let's pass inside here style. And we want to use a material theme. And here we're going to use header 4. Okay, let's pass inside here font weight, and we want this to be black. And let's create here a spacer, and we want a spacer of passing this. So here we can just pass in our content margin. Okay, let's create here a new text. And here now we want to display our result. So we can just call here our UI state. And if this is just going to be null, we are going to return 200. Okay, now let's pass inside here style. So here we want to use a material theme again. And we can use our typography.header6 for now. And here we want to make our font weight to be bold. And we want to align this to the end. So you can just call here modifier. And here we want to call our alignment.end. Okay, and here we can just pass inside here a spacer. Okay, now let's preview what we have coded. Okay, so here is just our output, and everything is looking good. Okay, so what we want to do is to create this text here. So now let's start by coding this. Okay, now let's collapse this. So here we have our first column, and we want to create those two brackets. So let's create here a row. And here we can just easily pass a modifier. And we want to fill the max width. Okay, now let's create here a spacer. And here we can just pass in our content margin. Okay, so we want to create here another composable function, which is going to be a reusable composable function for making our things. So we can just collapse all of these, and below here we can just create a new composable, and we can just call this character item. Now let's create here a little room. Okay, now let's pass inside here several parameters. So the first thing here is just our character, and this is just going to be of type string. And here we want to pass in a default modifier. And we can pass inside here our color. And by default here we want to use a material theme. And we can use the color surface here. And also here we want to pass in the on click. And this is going to return unit here. Okay, now let's create here a surface. Okay, so here we want to pass in a shape, and we can just make this to be a circular shape. And also here we want to pass in color, and we can just call here our color, which we have passed there. Okay, now let's pass inside here a modifier, and we can just call this modifier.clip. So we want when the user clicks, so the repo is going to be a rounded, not a box. So for this case here, we can just call here our circular shape. And we can just call this clickable. And here we want to invoke our on click. Okay, and also here we can just create our box. And we want to pass in here our content alignment, and we want to align this to the center. And let's create here a text. And now we want to pass in here a modifier. And we want to pass in here a padding of 8 dB. And we want to make this to be bold. And let's pass in here a style. So we want to call the material theme. Okay, now let's navigate here inside our home calculator. And inside here our row, we can just create our first character item. And here we want to pass in to be our opening bracket. Okay, now we want to pass inside here a modifier. And we can just pass inside here our padding. Okay, and here we want to pass in also a weight, and we want to be this 1F, and here we want to set this to be true, so the field to be true. Okay, so we want to duplicate also this, so we can just create here first a spacer. And here we want to pass in to be our closing bracket. Okay, so here we can just call our calculator view model, and here we want to call our on infix change, and here now we can just pass in to be our opening bracket. And we can just copy this and paste inside here our on click to the closing bracket, and here we change to be the closing bracket. Okay, now let's preview what we have changed. Okay, so here is just our output, and as you can see here we have a slight problem here. So we can just navigate inside here our character item, and we have not used this modifier here, so we can just easily change that by passing in here our default modifier. And for that case, let's rebuild again. Okay, so now here our buttons are taking up the whole space here. So now let's finish up by setting up the other components. Okay, so here what has remained is to create these inputs here, and as you can see here we have two columns. So we have here inside a row, so we can just create the first thing here inside our first item and the second item. So now let's deal with these numbers first. Okay, now here we can just create a spacer. we can just pass in here our content margin, and also inside here we have forgotten to add this spacer here below this, so we can just pass in here our spacer and we can easily collapse that. Okay, now let's create here a row. And here we want to create our numbers. And we can create a list of, and here we want to pass in a list of strings. So I have prepared this list of strings here. So you have to arrange them according to this order here. So you have to start 7, 8 until you get this data here. Okay, now let's create here a lazy vertical grid. And here we can just call grid cells. And we want to get a fixed column. So we want a column of 3. And we have to mark this as experimental. Okay, now here let's call our items. And here now we want to call here our numbers. So we have to select these items with a list. So here we can just pass in our numbers. And we can just rename this to number. Now let's call here our character item. And for now here, now we can just call here our number. And here we want to pass in a modifier. And also here we have to pass in a modifier. And we want to pass in here a modifier of weight, and we can just pass in here to be 1F because we are going to display 2 items side by side. So we have to pass in this weight here. And also here we have to pass in a padding. And here we can just call our content margin. Okay, so here we want to react to our on click. So we have several numbers here. So we want, when this C is going to be clicked, we want to clear the canvas. So what we have to do here, we can just check if number is not going to be equal to C, then here we can just call our calculator view model. And we can call the on infix change, and we want to pass in here our number. And else here we can just call our on clear. So we can call here calculator view model dot clear infix expression. So this one is just going to reset the infix expression. Okay, now let's preview our changes. Okay, so here is just our output. So we want to also add the other component here. So we want to create this operator view. So now let's finish by adding this. Okay, so achieving this type of UI here, we can just easily use a constraint layout because we have a complex alignment. So let's create here by using a constraint layout. Okay, now let's navigate inside here our build.gradle file, and we want to add here our constraint layout dependency. So here we have our constraint layout compose version 1.00. Now after that here we can just sync our project. Okay, now let's create here a constraint layout. And here we can just pass in here a modifier, and we want to pass in here a weight. And we want this to be 0.8F. Okay, now here we can create references. So for a case here, we have to create multiple references. So for example, here I'm going to pass all of these here. So you can just copy this, and also here you can call create refs. So this is just going to create multiple references. So if you don't know about constraint layout, I have linked the video inside the description box below or in the card above. Okay, so for now here we want to create our first item. So you can just call here character. And inside here, we are just going to pass in to be a minus sign. Okay, so here we want to pass in a modifier. And here we want to make this 50F, the height here. So we're going to pass in here a height. Sorry, here we have to pass in to be a DP, so 50 DP. And for that case here, we can just pass in here the constraint as, so that we can just pass in here the constraints. And here we want to call this to be a minus. So we have to pass inside here a references. Okay, and after that here we want to pass in the aspect ratio. So we want this to be a perfect cycle. So we can just pass in here a aspect ratio of 1/8. Okay, and after that here we want to change the color of this. So we can just call here our material theme. And we can just call here the secondary color. Okay, so here we have to pass in the constraints. So you can just easily, for example, here we want to constraint this to the top. We can call here top.link2, and we want to call here our parent.top. And also here this, we can just link this to the parent.start. And also we can link this to the end. So here we have to link to another composable. So we can just call here division. And also here we want to link this to the bottom. And here we are just going to link to another composable. So we are going to see all of this when we finish to hook everything up. Okay, and here we want to add this inside our Infix expression. So we can just call here our calculation view model. And here now we can just pass in a minus sign. Okay, so here we have our first item. Okay, now we can just easily copy this. And for now here we want to create another operator here. So we want to create a division operator. And here we can just call division also inside our constraint naming here. So constraint as, and here we pass in to be a division. Okay, also this we want to link to the parent.top. And here to start, we want to start from the minus. So we can just call here minus.end. And here we can just pass in here a content margin. And also we want to link this to the parent.end. So here we want to link this to the end of the screen. So we can just call here parent.end. And we can just delete this here. Okay, so we have that our second item. So we can just create another item here. Okay, also here we have to change this operator here. So we have to append another operator. And here's just the division operator. And also here we want to append the multiplication operator. So we can just pass that to be a multiplication. And here we can just call multiplication. Okay, so this we want to link the top to be at the bottom of the division.bottom. And here we can just pass in our content margin. And to the start here, we want to link this to the addition.end. And also here to the end, we want to link this to the end of the screen. So we can just call parent.end. And here we have to link to another composable, which we have not created, but we have the reference. So we want to link this to the power.top. So here we have another operator, and we can just pass in here the asterisks to be another operator. Okay, now let's create here another operator. Okay, now we want this to be a power operator, and also here we have to change the reference. So we can just call here power. Okay, so we want to link this to the multiplication. And we can just easily link this to the bottom. And also here we want to link this to the start to the addition.end. And here we can just pass in the content margin, which we have created there. And also here to be the content margin. And also here we want to link this to the parent.end. And here we can just pass in the content margin. And here we want to link this to the echo sign. So we can just call here echo the top. So we are going to see this when we create the echo sign. And also here we can just change the operator to be a power operator. Okay, now let's create another operator. Okay, now we want to create here the additional operator. So you can change this to be an addition. And here we can call addition to change the references. Okay, so we want to link this below the minus. So you can just call here minus.below .bottom. And also here we can just pass in our content margin. And we want to link to the parent.start. And also the end here we want to link below at the start of the multiplication. So we can just call here multiplication.start. So this addition is going to start when the multiplication is going to end. And also here we want to change this echo.top. So you can change this to be the constraint to the bottom to the echo. And here we want to pass in the content margin. So you can just call here content margin. And also here we want to, also here the addition, we want to make it the height to be bigger than the width. So we can just change the aspect ratio here. So you can just pass in here 1F with 2F. So this one is going to force to take a bigger height than the bigger width. And also here we can just change this to be an additional operator. Okay, so here also we want to create another operator. So we want to finish up by creating an echo operator. So you can just pass in here the echo operator. And for that case here, we can just change this to be echo. Okay, so we want to link this to the power.bottom. So you can just call here power.bottom. And we can just pass in here the content margin. And we want to link this to the parent.start, and the end also we want to link to the parent.end. And we can just pass in here our content margin to the end. And the bottom here, we want to link this to the bottom of the parent. So we can just call here parent.bottom. Okay, so as you can see here, also the echo sign has a bigger width than a height. So we have to change the aspect ratio here. So we can just add here a backward slash and give it a 2F. So this one is going to force it to occupy a bigger width than the height. Okay, also here we have to change this, and instead of passing here our calculator, we want to evaluate when we click the echo sign. So we can just call here our calculator view model. And we can call evaluate expression. Okay, so this is just going to help us to evaluate. Now let's re-preview here and see the changes we have made. Okay, so here is just our output, and as you can see here, we have a slight problem here. So this addition is just taking up a same space like this one. So we want this to take up a bigger space here. So we can just fix this when we navigate inside our code here. So we can just come inside here our character item, and instead of height here, we have to pass in a width because we want this to take up a bigger height. So we don't want to constrain it or to constrain to a fixed position. So we have to pass in here the width to be 50 so that the height could be bigger than the width. And also here inside our division operator, so we want to link this also when it's going to the end. Here we have to pass in a content margin so that it can take up a space. So let's now try to re-preview again and see. Okay, now so here is just our output, and I think everything is looking good. So we can just navigate inside here our main activity. So you can just jump inside here our code, and we want to call this inside our home. So the first case here, we have to obtain our view model. So you can just create here a val, and we want to call here view model. And here now we can just pass in here our calculator view model so that we can just get the reference to it. Or you can just use a compose view model. So for my case, I'm using a normal view model. And for that case here, now we can just call inside here our home. We can just call here home calculator, and we can just pass in here our view model. Okay, now let's try to rerun our application and see the changes we have made. Okay, so our application has launched successfully. Let's try here to test the operation. So you can just take here 9 plus 2, for example, and we can see that we get the answer. And when we click this button, it's going to clear up there. So for example, here we can take this to multiply also, and we get the answer. So I think everything is working good. So we can just, and here we get the answer. So guys, let's leave it here for this video. So if you find this video helpful, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more videos. Bye bye for now. See you in the next video.